Hello and welcome to this week's Securicy webinar. My name is Russell Sierakowski and I am the Customer Success Manager here at Securicy. In last week's webinar, we covered best practices around email security. This week, we're going to cover best practices on passwords. Joining us this week is Brian Sierakowski, CEO and founder of TeamPass, which was acquired by Jungle Disk in March of this year. TeamPassword offers a solution to help manage and share access to the passwords of the applications, software, services, and tools that your organization needs to keep working efficiently. Thanks for joining us today, Brian.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me.
Passwords may seem like a basic area of cybersecurity. However, many companies do not have a password policy in place, or what they have no longer meets the current standard. Tools like password managers have changed how easy it can be to implement a password policy and ensure that everyone at your company has a strong password. A recent news story from New Zealand looked at the passwords for all of their government employees. Over 1,400 government employees were using the password 123 for all of their government accounts. More than 5,000 were using a variation of password. If this can happen at the governmental level, it raises the question of what is happening in the private sector and why a defined password policy needs to be implemented and enforced. Today, we will cover all things password related. Following the webinar, we'll take a few moments to answer any questions that you may have. So let's get started. On the agenda today, we're going to cover the following topics: threats, password policy, complexity requirements, password age, password history, two-factor authentication, blacklisting passwords, what is a password manager, and why use a password manager. Password threats. In order to understand why you should follow best practices when it comes to passwords, you must understand the threats. There are a number of different types of attack vectors that focus on passwords. A few examples of the most common types of attacks are shoulder surfing. This is an attack where an individual simply tries to see your password as you type it in. They will need to be close to you in order to see what you are typing. In order to prevent this type of attack, be aware when entering passwords in public places. Never reveal passwords in front of people you do not know. Cover the keyboard when entering a password. Using a password manager is a great way to prevent this type of attack, as most tools will offer a form of autofill for your passwords. Brute force attacks. This consists of guessing your password either through manual entry or by using a software tool to attempt many variations of passwords. In order to prevent this type of attack, use two-factor authentication and never use simple passwords or personal information in your passwords that could be easily guessed. Dictionary attacks. This involves using all words found in a dictionary to try and crack a password. This is usually done using a software tool that will run through all the words in a dictionary. To prevent this type of attack, never use simple passwords using only one word or term. Use a more complex password or a passphrase. Weak passwords, sharing passwords openly, and writing passwords down are general threats and bad practices that you should never practice when it comes to your passwords. All three of these threats can be negated by using a password manager, which we'll touch on a little later in the webinar. Password policy. The need for a password policy should be pretty self-explanatory. If you do not set the guidelines for what is acceptable and what is not, nothing is stopping you or your employees from using an insecure password. The more insecure a password, the easier it will be for an attacker to guess or crack your password. Your password policy should explain clearly and simply the requirements to create a secure password, guidelines on changing passwords, the requirement to use two-factor authentication when possible, and the use of a password manager. Every person in your organization will need to read, understand, and follow this policy. Keeping it clear and concise will allow for greater adoption by your staff. This policy sets the baseline for all of your account security. If one individual does not have a secure password, it can cause company-wide issues. Once you have a password policy in place, your staff should be trained on the content within the policy in order for them to understand and help implement the policy. Complexity requirements. You must use unique passwords for each account and service that you use at your organization. If you use the same password for each account, once an attacker gets into one account, they can quickly get into any others. Along with using a unique password, your company passwords must also use passwords that are different from your personal accounts. An example would be never to use your Facebook or Twitter password for any company accounts or services. If your personal account is compromised, your company's account has a high probability of being compromised as well. Build a strong password by following the requirements of your password policy. Using a password manager makes the creation of complex, unique passwords very simple. Common requirements should include the following, including a minimum of 8 characters. Avoid words that can be found in a dictionary, either spelled backwards or forwards, including English words, non-English words, acronyms, or proper names. Do not use part of your login username or the name of the website or service. For example, if the vendor's website is acme.com, don't create a password like Acme Secret 123. Do not include any information that could be easily guessed based on your identity. So that includes never using phone numbers, dates of birth, anniversaries, children's or pets' names, or your home address. Use symbols and punctuation in your password. When possible, you should always include some of the following. If possible, include all of the following: lowercase letters, uppercase letters, numbers, punctuation, symbols, and even emojis or non-English characters. Password length. Why is password length important? Simply put, the longer a password, the harder it will be to guess, and the longer it will take to crack using a software tool. This is one of the most basic requirements in every password policy, and it is essential for ensuring a password is secure. Today, passphrases are becoming more common as they are not as complex as passwords, but they have a greater length, which can take longer to brute force. Generally, the most common minimum password length is at least 8 characters. For even greater security, you could set the minimum password length to 14 characters. For certain accounts, if you do not have a default minimum password length, the default can sometimes be 0. If your company does not have a password policy in place and has not changed these defaults in their software, it should be updated as soon as possible. A number of users in your organization could have very short, simple passwords that are highly insecure. Password age. The age of a password sets the standard for how long a user can keep a password before they are required to change it, and how quickly they can change a password after updating it. Passwords should have both a minimum and maximum age. A minimum will prevent users from updating their password and then immediately reverting it to their old password. A maximum age will set how long a password can be used before it has to be updated. Minimum ages usually range from 3 to 7 days, while maximum age is somewhere between 90 to 180 days, depending on the company. Currently, there are different opinions on how often passwords should be changed. Up until recently, it was the norm to have a limit to how long a password could be kept. This would prevent a user from using the same password forever and not changing it. However, current opinion varies on this subject. Many security experts looking at the data on minimum password age found that most users will end up using a less secure password in order to help them remember the constantly changing password. While this opinion varies on how often a password should be changed, it is important to update your passwords on a regular cadence if you can continue to use a secure password. Using a password manager helps to make the process simple by creating strong, unique passwords, but also by remembering them for you. This allows passwords to be kept secure, but also allows them to be updated easily. Password history. Password history sets the standard for how often an old password can be reused. Usually this is something like you cannot use the same password as your past 10 passwords. This will discourage users from always using the same password when they were required to update it, or using the same set of 3 or 5 passwords. While some technical staff may try to get around this history by changing their password and then updating it again shortly after, using a password history together with password age will prevent this from happening. While this may sound like a two-factor authentication. While this may sound like a difficult or technical setting to implement, it is becoming much more common. Two-factor authentication uses something that you have and something that you know. While you know your password, two-factor gives you another randomized code to input along with your password. This creates another layer of security. Usually two-factor is tied to your cell phone or an app like Google Authenticator. After signing in with your username and password, you will be prompted for your two-factor authentication. Depending on the service and how it is set up, you will either receive a text message with a code or will have to open an app and input the code that is displayed. If a cybercriminal does crack or guess your password, they will now need your cell phone or access to the authenticator application. You should never have two-factor authentication messages sent to your computer, as if your device was stolen, the code is then being sent to the attacker. Create password blacklists. A password blacklist is a list of passwords that cannot be used for your accounts. Many industry leaders in technology use these lists to prevent users from using insecure or common passwords. Microsoft, Google, and certain social media platforms use these lists to set a basic standard when it comes to passwords. By having this list or building it into your software, you can prevent your staff and users from using passwords like 123456, their own name, password, or password123. Attackers most commonly make use of brute force password software tools or guessing passwords. These tools or first guesses are almost always the most common passwords. By blacklisting these passwords completely, you will be able to force users into using something more secure. This blacklist should be used in combination with complexity requirements. I'm now going to throw it over to Brian, who's going to touch on password managers.
Sweet, thanks. Yeah, so what is a password manager? Password manager is a service that keeps all of your passwords secure, helps you create strong, unique passwords for each of your accounts, and can help you enforce a password policy. There's several different companies that offer password managers, and depending on your needs and the needs of your team, there's definitely one that will fit the bill. In order to maintain your organization's password policy, a password manager can be a great tool to keep you and your passwords secure. Almost every employee has multiple accounts that they're required to log into on a daily basis. It can be difficult for them to remember all of them. So to keep life simple, they'll generally fall into bad security habits. A password manager takes the worry out of password management for your staff by removing the need for them to remember passwords, allowing them to easily maintain password compliance. Some password managers offer a free version as well as a premium paid for service. Usually the paid service will offer more features and introduce things like sharing and better administration tools. Not only do password managers store your passwords in a secure encrypted format, but they also allow passwords to be filled into login forms. This helps simplify your life, allowing you to have a unique, strong password for each account, and the only password you need to remember is the one to your password manager. And then, so why should you use a password manager? Every organization should have a password policy. And when creating an account to a new service, you should always follow this policy to ensure that you're using at least the minimum requirements as outlined by your organization. So depending on the requirements and the number of applications, you have a large number of complex passwords to remember. Our research has shown that the average company has about 147 different passwords that people need to keep in mind. Passwords should never be written down and should be updated on a regular schedule. This can be done if this can be done securely, like we were saying earlier. Forcing users to always update passwords can lead to less secure passwords, unless they're using a password manager, which allows for the creation of complex, unique passwords so that they're difficult to crack. There are a number of great tools out there for password managers, so no matter what your team needs, there should be one that will fit the bill. Two-factor authentication should be used when possible on all accounts to support it, and you should use two-factor authentication with your password manager as well. Along with using a password manager to harden your password, two-factor authentication adds an extra layer of security to all of your accounts.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Brian. And I want to thank everybody for joining us this week. Now we can review any questions that you might have. You can use the little questions toolbar on the side to answer any questions or ask any questions. While we wait on those questions, next week's webinar will cover the topic. Next week's webinar is covering the topic of physical security and best practices around physical security. And I would also like to thank our guest, Brian, for joining us today and lending us his expertise on our webinar. Thank you very much, Brian.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And it looks like we have just one question coming in. Why has opinion changed on updating passwords regularly? And actually, an article actually just came out by one of the fathers of cybersecurity on this, and he was the one that actually advocating for changing passwords quite regularly. And the opinion has changed because people use less secure passwords when they're forced to change them on a more regular basis. And that's why opinion has kind of changed. Doesn't look like we have any other questions that have come in. Brian, have you ever had any frequently asked questions when it comes to passwords or password managers?
Yeah, I think that change one is a pretty common question. And yeah, definitely, if people are changing passwords frequently, but they're changing them to weak passwords, that's not a good thing. With TeamPassword, since our password manager is focused on teams, a lot of the questions that we get are more around the operations of implementing a password manager on your team. So how can you share accounts across multiple teams, or how can you manage, all these companies have 150 different passwords. So one thing that we usually recommend there is that if you're in the client services world, if you're our marketing agency or something along those lines, organizing your passwords. We have a groups feature, so grouping your passwords by each individual client is a great way to keep those organized and prevents you from one person who's working for one client doesn't necessarily need to see the passwords for another client. So that's a great way to increase security. If you're not in the client services world, or even if you are, another great way to group those passwords is by department. So one thing that we've seen with TeamPassword is people will create a group like the marketing group. And so they can keep all their marketing tools there, keep track of everything. And then when they're hiring new people, if they hire somebody new to the marketing team, all they have to do is add them to that marketing group. That'll give them exactly the right amount of access that they need. And you also won't share any accounts that they don't need to have access to in order to do their job. So we run into those sort of operational, like once people agree that they need a password manager, then the next question is like, okay, well, how do I do that? So that's a lot of the questions and a lot of the work that a lot of the conversation that we have with customers all the time.
Oh, that is awesome. Thank you for the insightful information. And actually, we have another question that just came in. Is there a password manager you would recommend? It really depends on your organization's needs. Actually, as Brian was talking about there, depending on your needs, you should actually investigate the software and kind of review all the different options. There are definitely a lot of them on the market, and certain ones cater to certain types of people. Like Brian was saying, if you have to share your passwords or if you have to make use of other functionality, maybe TeamPassword is a great option for you. If you're another company with other needs, maybe it would be a different software tool that you would look into for your password manager. So always evaluate the different options that are out there. A quick Google search will actually usually bring up some of the best options on the market. And I think that's it for questions. Again, thank you very much for joining us on the webinar. And thank you again, Brian, for lending us your time and your expertise today.
Absolutely.
Thanks, guys. Have a great day.